The Iranian sleeper cell threat is very real. Now, it could be an organized Iranian-backed group operating undercover and waiting on the order to strike, or something as simple as a lone wolf, inspired by recent events and propaganda to exact revenge on the United States. Now, as soon as this topic started getting coverage a couple weeks ago, I thought, there's one person I really want to talk to about this, and that one person is Dr. Colin Clarke. We're fortunate to be joined by Dr. Clarke today, who is the Director of Research at the Soufan Group and a Senior Fellow at the Soufan Center. We'll have links to both of those organizations, as well as Dr. Clarke's Instagram and Twitter handle in the description below. Be sure to give him a follow. And with that, let's get to the conversation. All right, Dr. Colin Clarke, sir, thank you so much for taking the time. Looking forward to getting your take on some of the most recent Iran stuff here.
Thanks for having me.
So a story that was in the news, and it seems like straight out of Hollywood, but in the last couple of weeks, as the U.S. was carrying out strikes in Iran, the term sleeper cell popped up. And could there be these Iranian sleeper cells in the United States, or is there a risk of them? Can you talk about that? Is that a real concern?
Yeah, well, it's a very real concern, and it's not a new concern either. There's many Department of Justice indictments that we could look back to where individuals associated with Lebanese Hezbollah have been arrested in the United States for surveilling and casing various targets, including many in New York, the Brooklyn Bridge, Rockefeller Center, and many others. So, look, you know, I've obviously been doing a lot of work on Iran and the axis of resistance for a long time, and then, you know, that kind of got kicked into overdrive since October 7th, 2023. But, you know, since 1979, we've been at odds with the current Iranian regime. And, you know, Iran is responsible for creating the group that would ultimately become Hezbollah. They dispatched 1,500 Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps trainers to Lebanon to train up and equip Hezbollah. That's in the early 1980s. And then you're aware of the U.S. Marine barrack bombing in 1983 that killed 241 U.S. Marines, which was the deadliest day for the Marines since Iwo Jima in World War II. So this is a group to be taken seriously. We've been going at it with them for a very long time. They have tremendous operational capabilities, global reach. So if you think back to 1992, after the Israelis clipped then Secretary General Abbas Moussaoui, Hezbollah launched large bombings in Argentina, so in Latin America. They've also got, cells in West Africa. They've conducted bombings in Europe and Bulgaria in 2012, and have been linked to attacks against Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia in 1996. So, no shortage of capability for this group. And now the concern becomes, now that the Iranians are so weak, is the intent there to lash out and to seek revenge against the United States on U.S. soil?
You mentioned a ton of questions after that, but you mentioned Hezbollah right out the gate. Is there any of this coming directly from Iran and the IRGC, or are they generally kind of filtering it or laundering it through these other groups?
Yeah, so they don't like to have their fingerprints directly on anything, and it's a great question, right? So I wrote a piece last Sunday in the New York Times, essentially what Iran might do next. And the first thing I suggested was that Iran was going to attack U.S. targets in the Gulf, which they did. Not something you want to be right about, but we saw that with the attack on Al Udeid in Doha, Qatar. The other potential option was to use its proxy forces to attack the United States, Israel, or U.S.-Israeli interests, embassies, kidnap citizens somewhere outside of the region. And after the ceasefire that's been agreed to, I heard a lot of analysts saying, oh, good, I'm glad there's a ceasefire. We don't have to worry about that. And I thought to myself, well, not so fast. Iran has been known to fight and talk, to negotiate, and to still conduct these types of operations. Now, they don't want their fingerprints directly on anything, but if the proxies, conducted a strike, that they could, again, people call it plausible deniability. To me, someone that studies this group so closely with like Hezbollah, it's implausible deniability. We know what their intentions are. But Hezbollah has been weakened significantly. I mean, you go back to last fall in September with the pager attack, which was kind of right out of a Hollywood movie, followed by the targeted assassination of the group's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, and then many subsequent leaders, in the or other individuals in the leadership cadre. Hezbollah is at its weakest point. I'd argue it's at a nadir that it hasn't been at probably throughout its history. And so, the group is weakened. However, and I think this is true of both Iran and Hezbollah, their comparative advantage has always been what I would call traditional terrorism, right? So we've seen Hezbollah, let's use the Syrian civil war as an example, kind of fighting more conventionally, fighting on the ground to prop up the Assad regime alongside the Wagner Group and other kind of violent non-state actors. It was great for them, battlefield experience. They got to test out new weapon systems. They got to function in almost a train the trainer model. But really their bread and butter, are these kind of traditional terrorist attacks like we saw in Argentina in 1992 and 1994, like we saw in Khobar Towers in 1996, like we saw with the bombing of a bus of Israeli tourists in Bulgaria in 2012. And so that's really what their, that kind of asymmetric option is what they're, I think, best positioned to do. And so I would say, this story is far from over. The ceasefire is tenuous. I mean, we're on a knife's edge here, and anything could cause it to collapse. Not least of which is the Israelis continuing to get chippy, and to kind of be very offensive minded. Again, understandable in a post-October 7th environment, but I would just say to all those that think, that this chapter is done, that's not the way I see it.
We're used to, at this point in the United States, dealing with varieties of Sunni jihadism, Salafi jihadism. With Iran and Hezbollah, you're talking about Shia. Is there any difference that comes when you're talking about you said traditional terrorism? Is there anything different there other than just Shia versus Sunni when you're thinking about this?
I mean, we're talking about the ideologies, right? But terrorism at its core, it's a tactic. And so anyone can do it, right? Anyone can engage in an act of terrorism. Anyone can start a terrorist group, whether that's, our kind of what we faced during the GWAT, the Global War on Terrorism, which was Sunni Salafi jihadist groups, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, their various affiliates, franchises, and branches around the world, or whether that's a white supremacist neo-Nazi group. Terrorism is simply, it's a weapon of the weak. It's an asymmetric tool. So in terms of ideology, there's clear differences between Sunni and Shia. There's, a real sectarian element there. But I will say Iran has bridged that gap. I mean, Iran mostly sponsors Shia groups, but also in its axis of resistance, you have Sunni groups like Hamas, like Palestine Islamic Jihad or PIJ. And don't forget, which many people do, Iran has provided safe haven and sanctuary to Al-Qaeda senior leaders for a very long time, including the de facto leader of Al-Qaeda now, Saif al-Adil. Now, that's a group that's been very quiet. It's been, below the radar for quite some time, licking its wounds. But, July 7th is upon us, 7/7, and we're coming up on the 20-year anniversary of the UK bus bombings, right, and subway bombings, which many people aren't even talking about, don't remember. It's a distant memory. So this is a group that has a long memory. Bruce Hoffman often talks about quietly and patiently rebuilding, and Iran maintains and cultivates these relationships because, they might need them, for a rainy day. And so they, much like Pakistan, there's this kind of, long-standing wink, wink, nod, nod with a range of militant groups that they then seek to use to conduct their, regional foreign policy.
I think the Iraq War scarred us in the United States to where we now view there's Shia, there's Sunni, and there's no overlap and no coordination at all, which is an oversimplification, of course. But is it within the realm of possibility that Iran could leverage an Al-Qaeda network or Al-Qaeda operatives for some sort of attack like that?
Absolutely. I mean, what's the point of providing them sanctuary? I assume at some point they're going to want something back from these guys. I put out a couple of tweets kind of asking the gods, while the Israeli assault of Iran was happening, I said, hey, if anybody could clip Saif al-Adil while you're in there, I'd really appreciate it. And I had a couple of people look at me sideways. I do want to pick up on one thing you said, and I'm glad you mentioned the Iraq War, because that's an entirely other aspect of Iranian terrorism that is maybe more kind of, mundane. But if you think about it, the Iranians, and through the now late Qasem Soleimani, the former leader of the IRGC Quds Force, they have a lot of blood, a lot of American blood on their hands, because they were responsible for providing EFPs, explosively formed penetrators, where these kind of like souped up improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, that killed a lot of American soldiers and wounded and maimed many more. And so it was the Quds Force that was providing these, as well as the tacit knowledge to Shia militia groups throughout Iraq to then go and attack the United States. So, there's all these different debates taking place. Who's at fault? Is Iran really the victim? And I've shed no tears for what's happening to the Iranian regime. And if the supreme leader gets killed, same thing. I won't shed a tear for that guy. He's got a lot of American blood on his hands going back over the years. And to me, it's you reap what you sow.
When you're looking at the possibility of international terror attacks, is this, from our knowledge, is this running up through the Quds Force in the IRGC, or is this a different entity within Iran that might oversee that?
So, the Quds Force has taken a beating. A lot of the upper echelon of Iran's military and intelligence has been eliminated by a pretty masterful Israeli operation. I mean, the Israelis have penetrated Iran's networks up to the highest reaches. One of the things that Iran does with its axis of resistance is it kind of provides them with the tools. And then, as we saw with October 7th, it lets them make the judgment call of kind of when to act. I've used this analogy before, and bear with me if you will. The U.S. Army has something called Mission Command, right, where you're kind of training soldiers down to the tactical level, and then you're expecting them to be able to operate without having to kick everything back up the chain of command. So it's somewhat similar, the way that Iran deals with its various proxy groups. Now we're still trying to get to the bottom of, how direct of a role Iran played in green lighting the attacks of October 7th. And I think there's more and more evidence coming out that they did sanction this. Now, they might not have said, do it on this date, with these forces, but they certainly were aware. There's multiple planning meetings, including in Beirut. And that's how the Iranians operate, is they build up these forces. So, whether that's Lebanese Hezbollah, groups like Kataib Hezbollah and various other Iraqi Shia militias, the Houthis in Yemen, right? And Iran furnishes them and supplies them with all sorts of advanced technology and weaponry, including drones and cutting-edge missiles. Now, again, the axis has been severely debilitated, but it hasn't been destroyed. And I have no doubt that if the current regime stays in power, which seems likely, at least at this stage, they're going to build these forces back up.
There was a couple of days ago a fatwa issued against, it appears to have been against Netanyahu and Trump, calling out the people that were targeting the Iranian leadership or the leadership of the Iranian regime. Does that come into play at all? My view of that was more like a call to lone wolves, kind of political cover. Do you see that playing in at all to these sleeper cell type issues?
Yes and no. I mean, you don't need a fatwa from the supreme leader to know that Iran is going to try to attack Israel and the United States. Every other thing they say is death to America and death to Israel. I think Khomeini is, he's 86 years old. He's watched his life's work crumble before his eyes, and the guy's delusional. I mean, he's going out there chirping. First of all, how does he still have a Twitter account?
It's great. Right? I love it.
And he's going out there and making these broad proclamations of victory. I mean, talk about being out of touch. So, it doesn't take a fatwa from him to activate these networks. Now, here's what I am concerned about. I'm concerned about what we would call HVEs, homegrown violent extremists, people glomming onto that ideology. If you recall, a few years ago, there was an incident up at the Chautauqua Institute where Salman Rushdie was giving a talk, and some American from New Jersey who was all hyped up on IRGC propaganda went and attacked him and stabbed him, right? And so you could be concerned about an incident like that. You also have to factor in, residual anger from the war in Gaza and some of the things that we've seen already take place on American soil. There was the attack in Washington, D.C. There was also the attack in Boulder, Colorado, right? So these kind of lone wolf, homegrown violent extremists. There's been examples of American citizens trying to travel to the Middle East and join Hezbollah, right? And so, including somebody that served in the U.S. Army. How many people like that are still out there? And the FBI and DHS put out a bulletin for July 4th. Their biggest concern is lone wolf attacks. To say nothing of this other concept that we've been grappling with in terrorism studies for the past few years, which we kind of call salad bar terrorism, a term coined by former FBI Director Christopher Wray. Salad bar terrorism, in short, is kind of picking and choosing different pieces of ideologies. So, you have some neo-Nazi guy that also is obsessed with jihadis. So you could see kind of, I'll take that, I'll leave that, and kind of kludging together all of these different ideologies. And a lot of this is, catalyzed by the internet, right? These kind of weird strands of thought that are out there. And then that motivating somebody to go over the line and actually commit a targeted act of violence against, an Israeli target, a Jewish target, an American target, what have you, as a kind of manifestation of various grievances.
Not to downplay the attacks in D.C. and Boulder, but I had thought for a while now we were going to see a lot more inspired violence coming out of the war in Gaza. It seems like it's been right on the tipping point for so long, and we're just fortunate that it hasn't. I haven't heard very much about people getting rolled up in operations, so maybe it just hasn't penetrated to the degree we thought, but I wonder if we're at risk of assuming that's not as much of a threat.
Look, and there's always a lag effect to these things too, right? And so we've got a whole generation now of kids, young adults that see the world very differently than previous generations. Just look at what's been happening on university and college campuses, right? So I think we're going to continue to see a big rise in anti-Semitism, coupled with Islamophobia, and then you get into this concept that we call reciprocal radicalization, where one side radicalizes the other, and then you kind of continue to spiral down there. And any event that happens in the Middle East could be that tipping point, right, where somebody says, nope, this is too much for me. And then when you look at the psychology of violent extremism, there's all these other factors that play a role, right? What people are going through in their own personal life, all these other things that kind of push people, and to say nothing of the propaganda that's being pumped out by our adversaries overseas.
I don't want to skip by. I feel like I'm skipping by something here where, like, what is the goal? If Iran were to carry out some sort of or tangentially be behind a terrorist attack in the United States, what are they trying to get at in doing that?
I'd say, two things primarily. One is revenge, right? This is a regime with a long memory, and they've had a pretty rough last 20 months where, if you look at this project that they've created with the Axis, it's been totally shellacked. And, they're now sitting there trying to put the pieces back together. Think back. Iran has already tried to assassinate President Trump, Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, right? And so they do have, revenge does play a role there. And I'd say the other would be some form of deterrence, right? To remind the United States that if you get involved in a conflict with Iran, we can make it painful for you, really painful. And so you may want to think twice. And in fact, Khamenei threatened this. Khamenei, he said, we're going to unleash all these terror cells on you. Now, a lot of what he says is total bullshit. But I think there is, a grain of truth there. And, thankfully we have world-class intelligence services. The FBI is aware of this threat. They're monitoring it. But again, it's not static. It's a highly dynamic threat. I was watching Face the Nation last week, and I think it was Michael McCall, who talked about 11 Iranians that were nabbed coming over the border, including people with links to the Iranian government and Hezbollah. So this isn't something that is going to fade away. This is a long-term threat. And, you know, one of my main concerns, and this is something I've been talking about, we've talked about this, I talk about this a lot with our friend and colleague Lucas Weber, there's been a real shift away from counterterrorism toward great power competition, toward these other priorities. And I think the bench is quite thin, in terms of manpower that we have dedicated to this, to CT. And then the resources have been shifted considerably. And in fact, under the Trump administration and DOGE, a lot of programs that study violent extremism have been totally jettisoned. And so I think, to me, that's incredibly myopic. And that's another thing when I talk about this lag effect. We may not see the impact tomorrow, but we may see it 6, 12, 18 months down the road.
Digging into that a little bit more, last year at the SUFON terrorism summit in D.C. or in New York, which was incredible, it seemed like a lot of the focus was on the threat of Shia groups and the terrorism and the terrorist threat that they would pose, just like we're talking about today. My guess is that a lot of U.S. intelligence focus over the last 20 years has been more on the Al-Qaeda Islamic State threat. Have you seen any realignment there? Is that still ongoing, or is that a shortcoming right now, shifting that focus?
So first of all, you're right. For 20 years of the global war on terrorism, we had a soda straw view of the threat of terrorism, right? We looked very narrowly at a subset of violent extremists that, were Sunni jihadists. Now, it was also the most potent threat, and it also, it metastasized into AQ and the Islamic State, and we saw the mobilization of tens of thousands of foreign fighters from, 80 different countries traveling to Iraq and Syria, including many from the West, trying to join that group. I think we lack the experience and the knowledge base of people that are familiar with Shia groups. And, you can't just take somebody that was working on China or working on fentanyl or AI and make them a Hezbollah expert overnight. Many of the people that dealt with that group historically have retired or have, moved on. So that's one of my main concerns, is that we don't have as many people as we need that are familiar with the tactics, techniques, and procedures of these Shia groups. I think across the board, there was always going to be a correction after the GWAT, right? Because we spent so much money and just, so many resources on that threat. But I think we've overcorrected. I think we've totally pivoted away, and the pendulum swung way too far in the other direction. Whereas we now, the cupboard's bare in some respects in terms of who we have that's really experienced and kind of battle hardened and knows how these groups think, how they communicate, how they network, how they plot, plan, and conduct their activities.
Well, I'm sure we'll get that fully built back up and fully staffed just in time for something to veer off in another direction and completely lose focus.
Exactly.
Colin, thank you so much for taking the time. Where's a good place for people to follow your work?
So I'm on X or Twitter at Colin P. Clarke. I'm on Instagram as well, same handle at Colin P. Clarke. And then, as always, you can go to our website, the SUFON Center. Just Google it, and every Monday through Friday we put out something called the Intel Brief, the daily Intel Brief, which focuses on a different aspect of international security or foreign policy, and it's free right off our website, as all of our products are. We have research reports, what we call violent non-state actor snapshots. It's kind of a one-stop shop for everything you need to know in terms of foreign policy, with a heavy dose of the Middle East.
There we go. We'll link all that in the description below. And Intel Brief, by the way, for anybody listening, worth checking out. That is a really high-quality product. But Colin, thank you again so much for taking the time, sir.
Anytime, Preston.
So thank you very much again to Dr. Clarke for taking the time to chat with us for a bit today. Again, in the description below, you can find links to his Twitter or X and Instagram account, as well as the SUFON group and the SUFON Center. And hey, don't sleep on that Intel Brief put out by the SUFON Center that he was talking about. That's a really high-quality product. I think you guys are going to like that, so worth checking that out as well. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching. and I'll see y'all next time.